Greetings, everybody, on what is sadly the final day of our time together. It seems it's gone very, very quickly. And just like a flash of lightning, like a bubble, like foam, it just all disappears. Before we begin, just in case we end up being pressed for time at the end, I want to take a moment to thank the Abbey once again, to thank Thupten Chudrinla once again for all of her hard work, not only for organizing this event, but for establishing the monastic community so firmly in America and creating Shravasti Abbey as such a beacon for study and serious practice. This is really wonderful. And I also want to thank all of the people who have been involved in maintaining this event, especially Damchula, who's done tremendous work behind the scenes, keeping the website going, keeping the streaming going, making sure that I'm on task and with the right questions in front of me. And I'm very, very grateful. But also to all of the people who have been asking such superb questions, both at the Abbey and online. Those questions really enable the teaching to be more effective, enable others to be able to understand more. The challenges and the prods to me help me understand things better than I did before. I always say to friends, the greatest benefit of having the opportunity and the gift of being able to teach is that you learn so much more. And I always learn far more from my students than my students learn from me. And so I thank you all for that as well. I just wanted to make sure that all of that gets said before the end, because sometimes the end just crashes down with great suddenness. Thank you once again. We're all familiar with this phenomenon. A few really good questions and suggestions came in over the transom last night, and I want to begin, as I ever do, with those, and then turn to the remainder of Alambana Pariksha Vimikpatakpa to conclude what we're doing. My fervent hope is that I can move through it efficiently enough that we can open things to general discussions and questions at the end. But I'm always skeptical of my ability to move as quickly as I intend to, and always find myself behind schedule. So if we don't get to a general discussion, that's just how life goes. Suvansh Kapoor pointed me to a wonderful text that I had completely forgotten about before I began these teachings, and would have been a great place to start. And that is the Bahaya Sutta in the Pali Canon, reminding us once again that it's not just the second and third wheels that are very much consistent with one another, but all three wheels, and that so many of the ideas that we have been exploring in these third wheel teachings are present in the first wheel. And I'm just going to read a little bit of the translation of the Bahaya Sutta that Suvansh sent me, so you'll see what I mean. This is an early Pali text. The Buddha says, "I will teach you the Dhamma, Bahaya. Listen carefully to my words. Train yourself in this manner. In what is seen, there is only the seen. In what is heard, there is only the heard. In what is sensed, there is only the sensed. In what is cognized, there is only the cognized. When for you there is in that which is seen only the seen, in that which is heard only the heard, in that which is sensed only the sensed, and in that which is cognized only the cognized, then, Bahaya, there is no you in connection with what is seen, heard, sensed, and cognized. There is no you there. When there is no you there, you are neither here, nor there, nor anywhere in between. This and only this is the end of suffering and unhappiness." Gosh, isn't that a beautiful anticipation and summary of what we've been talking about in Yogacara? And there it is, right there at the beginning in the first turning, reminding us that not only are the Yogacara texts not Mahayana for dummies, but the Pali Suttas are not Buddha Dhamma for dummies. Those of us who practice in the Mahayana tradition should always remind ourselves to go back to read Pali Suttas and Pali commentaries to ground our teaching and our practice. It is there for us. We have not gone beyond that yet. So thank you very much, Suvansh, for reminding me of that text that I must say I had completely forgotten about before I began these teachings. And it's a great Pali text to read in connection with this.
Jay?
Yeah.
Or Siobhan, can you give us the reference in the Pali Canon, which Nikaya it's in, and the number of the sutra?
That would be great, because I don't have that handy. I have only what Suvansh sent me, but it's the Bahia Sutta, Bahia. And so you should be able also to search it very quickly. There it is. Sagar tells us it's in Udanavaga, book 110. So there we are. It's in the Udanavaga. Thank you very, very much. It's amazing how much Buddha Dhamma you can simply allow to forget as you learn more. And it's really important to train ourselves to remember these things. The older I get, the more I forget. So I apologize for not having opened with that sutta, which is what I would have done had I been a more skillful teacher. But that's why we have students, to remind us of all of our failings. Boris asks a really nice question that takes us back to issues that we've talked about only in passing. He asks us, in what way is the non-duality of subject and object in Chittamatra, or Yogacara, different from the lack of self-sufficient, substantially self in Sautrantika? And I would once again say these things are all very closely linked, because when we give up subject-object duality, we're giving up the self. As this sutta says, when we recognize that in seeing there's only the seen, when we give up object, we give up subject, and that gives up subject-object duality. The only difference is the direction from which we're proceeding. And as I say, what's distinctive about Yogacara is not the philosophical position, it's the perspective from which it's articulated. It's the perspective of subjectivity. Leah asks, says, I'm hoping you'll talk explicitly about other beings as experienced objects and the implications of the three natures with regard to other beings, so as to attempt to avoid any temptation to solipsism. Yes, let me say a few things about that now. Have been trying to remind us of that issue all along, but I'm going to make sure that we remind ourselves of it once again. When we're thinking about the objects of our experience, when we're thinking about the world we experience, the world as we experience it, maybe the most important objects of our experience, if you want to think about that way, are our fellow sentient beings. Teacups are really important. Pots, cups, all tables, chairs, all of the objects that we use whenever we start talking about emptiness, pillars, they're all really important. None of them are as important as other sentient beings. And the delusions that we create about pots and cups and pillars and tables are indeed important delusions, as are the delusions about the things that we end up coveting, like Mercedes-Benzes and fancy toys and things like that, and the things to which we become averse. But none of those are as important as the other sentient beings upon whom we also superimpose subject-object duality, upon whom we also superimpose the properties that we experience them as having. When we superimpose that subject-object duality, we create a world in which we are the center of the moral universe, and in which those things are merely objects to our own satisfaction or to our own release from suffering. And that makes it impossible to cultivate the Brahmaviharas. That makes it impossible to really take other people seriously as people who share the world in which we live. Not only other people, but all other sentient beings. My dog has just reminded me. And the wonderful cats at the Abbey would remind you in an instant. So that's all very important there. The other piece, though, is that the superimposition of the properties of the objects as experienced, as opposed to the objects as they might be independent of our experience, as objects as we might imagine them from their own side, allows us to ignore the way our own attitudes towards others colors our impression of who they are, that our fear turns them into threats, that our attraction turns them into friends, special friends, and sort of members of our circle as opposed to others. I'm constantly reminded here of Buddhaghosa's reminder, something I may not have talked about, but it's really worth thinking, of the fact that every Brahmavihara comes not only with a far enemy, but a near enemy. And those near enemies are so tightly associated with this kind of superimposition. And they're the insidious ones, right? Because they're the ones that masquerade as virtues. So that when I try to cultivate karuna, this attitude of care for others, the near enemy is a debilitating sympathy where I end up not caring about others, but literally feeling their pain and being entirely disabled by that and being incapable of acting as an appropriate moral agent. The near enemy of Maitri, of friendliness or friendship, is egocentric attachment, where I think about my friends as opposed to my enemies, my friends as opposed to your friends, and that leads to tribalism. The near enemy of upeksha, of this kind of equanimity or impartiality, is a failure to really take anybody else seriously, is a kind of blasé attitude towards others, and so forth. So we have to really worry about those near enemies. And it's really important to see that those near enemies come in part from superimposing the way we feel about others as a property of those others. And so anytime we're thinking about superimposition and subject-object duality, well, it might help us to start by thinking of apples. Apples aren't the end point. Apples are the beginning stage, and it's other sentient beings who are the end state. Because in the end, Buddha Dharma is really about our relationship to other sentient beings, as we are reminded when we chant the refuge. We're reminded of that when we dedicate merit, and we ought to be reminded of that every time we look around the world and recognize all of those beings to whom we owe everything that we are, both positive and negative. So that's why I want you to think about that. And the antidote towards solipsism is to remember, when we say that things are mind only, that's not to say that everything is imaginary. That's to say the subject-object duality is imaginary. Our other sentient beings are very real. It's our dualistic relationship to them that is the object of negation. Just as in Madhyamaka, we don't say that the object of negation is conventional phenomena. The object of negation is the superimposition of intrinsic existence on conventional phenomena. Similarly, in Yogacara, the object of negation is not the object of our experience. It's the subject-object duality that schematizes that experience and that distinguishes us from others and allows that distance between subject and object to open up. And that's the distance that stands between us and spontaneous awakened engagement. So that's really my kind of ethical sermon on how to think about this and how to avoid the solipsistic conclusion that some people might erroneously derive from Yogacara or Chittamatra ideas. B asks a very pertinent and very immediate question. Is there anything in Vasubandhu's teachings that help us to persuade a conspiracy theorist who experiences the current coronavirus pandemic as a hoax, or persuade a racist who experiences Black people as dangerous or less than human? Well, I think there's two answers to that. One answer is, obviously, if you can persuade that person to study Buddha Dharma very carefully and to distinguish their own superimpositions on things from those things themselves, that might be a help. But as a matter of upaya, my own suggestion is that when you're dealing with conspiracy theorists and racists, suggesting that the immediate detour is through studying 5th and 6th century Indian texts is probably not the most skillful way to go. That's a very, very long road out of those particular kleshas. You should be grateful that you are far along on that road, that you can use these texts as a way to uproot your own kleshas. But I would actually try to engage quite directly. Try to explain to people the difference between truth and falsity and what a real news source is as opposed to a propaganda source, to really get them to focus on the microbiology as opposed to the politics, to get them to focus on the shared humanity that we all have as human beings rather than on Yogacara doctrine. I would put the I'd put the hardcore philosophy aside in favor of as rapid a change in in immediate attitudes as possible. Much as I wish that the best way to solve every problem was to get people to study early Indian Buddhist philosophy, I just think that's just not necessarily the best upaya in most of our political discussions. Notice, for instance, that the Democratic National Committee will have very few advertisements that will cite Vasubandhu, and there is a reason for that. I support them in that. Call me a heretic, but there it is. And Rick Nelson asked me, please, before I finish, to return to ethics. Rick, I just did it. And I'll probably do it again, but that's my return to ethics. I just want everybody to remember, everybody who's listening to this to remember, as far as I am concerned, all of the real philosophical punch in studying these texts, however abstract and cognitive they might seem, is in their potential for ethical transformation. If they don't have the potential to transform us ethically, then no matter how interesting they are, no matter how fascinating they are, no matter how much they might uproot misapprehensions about the nature of cyclic existence, I would say put them aside for something that does have ethical power. Because ethical transformation, I believe, is our most urgent need. And I'm not saying that on behalf of anybody else. I'm not saying that's the only way to think about Buddha Dharma. I'm telling you how I, Jay, think about this, that that's the most urgent need. And I study these texts, well, in part because they're really interesting and really beautiful, and I gain insight into the nature of my experience, but primarily because I think of them as vehicles for moral transformation. And I would urge you to think of them as vehicles for moral transformation as well. If you don't want to, that's your choice, and other people have different reasons for studying. That's my own view. I just share that with you as a desire. Carol asks about Yogacara ontology, and I would say the ontological face of Yogacara, to the extent that there is one, lies in the idealistic side of Yogacara. And as I said, I've been steering clear of that right now, because I think that people have studied and talked about the idealistic side of Yogacara enough. And there's enough discussion, both positive and negative, about that. And I find it maybe simply less interesting, more as an objective refutation, more as something that we come to Prasangika to see why not to read things that way. But what I care about is the way that Yogacara can really benefit us. And I think that that's through this phenomenological understanding and not through the ontology or the idealism. Nonetheless, that I don't want to deny that idealistic ontology is there. As my friend John Powers once put it in a great discussion, he said, look, if people want to say that there's no idealism in Yogacara, then you have to ask, why did Madhyamikas criticize that idealism so much? And why did Yogacaras defend themselves against that criticism so much? Well, because it's there, but it's not all that is there. And so I want to emphasize, you can take that part as really interesting. I think the most interesting stuff is the stuff that I'm talking about, the phenomenology, because as His Holiness the Dalai Lama said, echoing Bhutan, echoing Rangtan, if we think of Yogacara as exploring emptiness from the side of the subject, then we can understand the truly transformative power of Yogacara. And I don't think we get that as much when we think about Yogacara as idealism. And I'm interested in transformation, not just philosophical speculation. Much as philosophical speculation is fun. And those are the questions that came in overnight. I hope that that has been some help. Before I come in to verse 3 and this really fascinating third option, let me ask if there are any further questions I should answer before I dive back into Alambana Pariksha. Hearing none and seeing none, I come back into Alambana Pariksha. Now, the third verse introduces a really interesting divergence of ways of understanding this text between the Indo-Tibetan tradition and the Indo-Chinese tradition, and reflects, in a way, the difference in emphasis between Dharmapala's commentary, which went to China but not to Tibet, and Vinitadeva's commentary, which went to Tibet but not to China. And this is a case where I think Dharmapala makes some very, very interesting points, and his commentators in China really picked these up very powerfully and run with them. And so it's interesting, and Geshe Eshitopke notes this in his commentary, that whereas it's traditional in Tibetan commentaries to think of there as being two options with regard to the Alambana, with regard to the percept explored in this text. That is, if we're thinking of external objects, it's either the fundamental particles or the entire object, the collection of those particles, excuse me, and that in the first place we get causation but no representation. That sounds almost like Thomas Paine. And in the second, we get representation, but no causation. And so that's the way the dilemma gets constructed. And then in the Tibetan tradition following Vinitadeva, we see what's happening in the in verse 3 as another way of elaborating that second option. In the Chinese tradition following Dharmapala, we see a third option being introduced here. And the Chinese take the third option to be the really important and interesting one, and spend most of their time working on that. So I'm going to talk about that third option for a minute, and it's kind of interesting. And it also makes the text, in a lot of ways, more tightly connected to contemporary worries in metaphysics and the theory of perception as well. So I'm going to introduce it by using the example that Dharmapala uses and that runs through the Chinese commentaries. And it's the example of trying to solve a problem that occurs in the roads after storms. So just suppose that in the driveway leading up to Shravasti Abbey, suppose there's a huge windstorm. Now, I haven't been to Shravasti Abbey, so I'm just imagining this, right? Are there big, tall trees as you come up? Good, I want there to be big, tall trees, because without the big, tall trees, the example doesn't work. So there are big, tall trees, and one of those trees, after the windstorm, blows down across the driveway. And so nobody can get out to go shopping, nobody can come in to bring groceries, and there's a dramatic threat to the Abbey. Has this ever happened?
Does happen.
Good. Okay. So now we'll see that Dignaga was really worried about that possibility, or at least according to Dharmapala and his Chinese commentators. So here's what happens now. There's two possibilities. Here's possibility number one. All of the residents of the Abbey go out and they say, that tree is way too heavy for any one of us to move. We're going to have to do this together. And so Chidrinla, as the abbess, says, okay, here's how we'll do it. First, I'll push for a few minutes. Then Damchala will push for a few minutes. Then Lamsel will push for a few minutes, right? And we'll each take turns pushing. And after we've each pushed, the log will be moved. The residents of the Abbey do this for a while, and they say, this isn't working. Fundamental particles like us don't have enough causal oomph to cause this thing to move, they say. And then somebody has a brilliant idea. Damcha, being Singaporean, probably has the brilliant idea because Singaporeans are notoriously good at organizing things. She says, how about if we all pushed at the same time? And everybody says, why would you ever want to do that? She says, just try it and let's see what happens. Everybody pushes at the same time and shazam, the log actually moves. Okay, that's the example that Dharmapala uses to explain why the third option, and why he calls it a third option, is the really interesting option for the alambana. Now it's time to explain the analogy, because it may not be entirely clear. The idea is that if we're thinking about what has the power to cause us to have an experience, to cause us to have a representation in consciousness, and can appear in consciousness. Remember, that's what we're looking for. The percept, the alambana, has to satisfy those two conditions. Let's remind ourselves of this. It has to cause us to perceive, and it has to be what appears in perception. Otherwise, we don't have full perception. So the idea is that, well, maybe these individual atomic particles that we thought of that would have the causal oomph can't cause us to have the experience or the representation individually, like each nun pushing the log one at a time. But maybe if we put them all together, a new causal power emerges that is different from the causal power of each individual one. A new collective causal power emerges, and that's enough to push the log. And because it's all together, that's also what appears. And so the third suggestion that is referred to here by our translation is collective features, right? Or collecting all of these aspects together. And is what actually is the percept. Just like all of the nuns pushing together had a strength in numbers. Now this is sounding like good old Union songs. You're in the Northwest. Think about Joe Hill's songs about strength in numbers during the great Fraser River strikes in Washington. There's nothing wrong with all these great Union songs, right? There's a power in a band of working men, he's saying, when they stand hand in hand, right? Who would have thought that old socialist lyrics would be relevant to teaching the Dharma? But you never know where you're going to have sources. So the idea is that that power doesn't come from individuals or individual little atoms, but it arises from the union of all of those. And then the idea is, moreover, it's the union of all of those that appears when you see this thing. That is what Dharmapala says is the third option. And his Chinese commentators say that's the most interesting option, because that actually sounds like it makes sense. In the language of modern contemporary metaphysics, we would say that that's a supervenient phenomenon, something that's not reducible to the powers of the individual things, but arises when they all come together. And that's the thing that we want to talk about as the percept. So that is the third option. And the question is, why won't that third option, which would also be an external object, count as the percept, as the alambana? Let me pause to first make sure that that third option and the way that it's motivated by the example, which is not in the Indian sources and Tibetan sources that we have, but rather is in this older Indian source. How is it clear what that's supposed to be and why that's different from the first two options? Okay, then I'm happy. I'm not hearing questions, so I'm assuming that means that it's clear. All right. So then the next question is, why won't it work? It sounds so good. And the why won't it work is a complicated little argument. And it's hard to tease out of the root text. And so I'm going to there's a question that just came from Sagar Rao about this issue. I'm going to answer it now. He asks, the first option is the atoms themselves. The second is the whole. The third is the whole object which supervenes on the atoms. Yes, that's exactly right. And so it's subtly different from the second one, because if we think about the second option, which is just the whole thing, we're saying, oh, all the causation is with the atoms, but the appearance is with the whole. And this one is saying, no, a new kind of causation emerges when we have the whole. So we do have something that's capable of bringing those two conditions together, causation and appearance. Remember, that's the trick. The big problem Dignaga is starting with is, where do you get those two necessary conditions of the percept joining? And his suggestion is that most people think that that's in the external object, and most people are wrong. So we've dispensed with the atoms individually, we've dispensed with the whole, and now it is, how about this kind of union that supervenes upon them? I'll call it the Joe Hill option for that reason, just because you're up there in the Northwest. Now, and I'm revealing my political past, right? What's wrong with that? What Dignaga writes is, he says, some maintain that collected features are the cause, all these things collected together. But he says the features of minute particles aren't the object of cognition any more than solidity is. According to them, cognitions of things like pots and cups would be identical. And if they're distinguished by different features, they don't belong to substantially real particles, because there is no difference in their dimensions. I've read all of that together because it's kind of a single thought. Now we have to try to explain what that single thought is. And the single thought is a single thought that many people raise as an objection to the supervenience idea. Because if you have granted already that all of the causal oomph is in the individual particles, then you owe us an explanation of where this new causal oomph is supposed to be. So by describing the removal of the log, sorry, I'm not getting out of sentences as quickly as I'd like to, but that's okay, it makes me speak slower. By describing the removal of the log as the kind of joint effort of all of the nuns working together, they say, all I'm really doing is taking the causation from each nun and doing it all at the same time. There's really nothing new there. It is only different from taking turns, in that taking turns takes the same causation in sequence, and this takes that same causation all at once. There's no new causation. The way that this is put in terms of cups and pots looking the same is that if you've got, imagine if you were trying to explain how all of the atomic particles of a cup produced the appearance of a cup, and all the atomic particles of a pot produced the image of a pot. What you need to do is to explain how each particle contributes to that. And what you don't want to say is that they all contribute exactly the same thing, right? Because otherwise you wouldn't be able to distinguish like a big cup from a small pot, or a small pot from a big cup if you just had lots of different particles. Instead, what you've got to do is explain how those cup particles are arranged in a different way from those pot particles. But that's a matter of arrangement, not different causation. So the idea here is that you still have got the problem. You still haven't explained where the causation is coming from. This is a question, a challenge that reductionists level against supervenience, or as Michael says, I could have said emergence, theorists all the time. They say you act as though there's new causation when you put these things together, but there's not. There's just the same old causation all happening at the same time. So Dignaga is saying, you might want to say all that stuff, but you still haven't solved the problem. still haven't solved the problem of where of how you get causation and appearance together. Because all those little particles working together, they're still not what appears. Even when all the nuns are pushing together, what appears is a whole bunch of nuns. What's doing the causation is one nun and another nun and another nun and another nun. And the fact that they're doing it together doesn't change anything, Dignaga says. It just means that you get the job done faster. So that's Dignaga's response to the third option. Now, then we get to the really good part. Because what he says is, of course, the cognition that has the appearance of them disappears when the particles disperse, right? That is, if the particles disperse, if you smash the cup or smash the pot or take the trees apart from the forest, then the cognition disappears. And that shows that it was the individual things that had the power to produce it. That's where the causal oomph was, right? Not in the collective. So it's not as though somehow something new has been created. The essence of an explanation in terms of supervenience or in terms of putting everything together is that you think that there's some new power in that assembly. But Dignaga says, you know that there's no new power, because when you take all the components away, the assembly goes away too. And so all of the power, all of the causation came from the components. How tragic. And this is something you can try at home. If you've got a cup that can hold tea, if you smash it and then try to get it to hold tea, you'll discover that it won't work. And this is just a great way to prove that Dignaga was right about this. I'm not recommending that you do this. I mean, it's a terrible waste of a cup, but maybe it's an ugly cup that's already chipped and you don't like it. Then you can try this experiment and then you'll find out that it really works. It's always nice to have experimental confirmation of theoretical ideas. Okay, now we get to the, so far in this text, and we've come through most of the text. The nice thing about short text is it doesn't take very long to get through them. But this is a profound text, as you can see, in a very short compass. It does a lot of hard philosophy. So far, what we've been doing is the negative phase of the text. So like most Indian Buddhist texts, Dignaga begins by setting up the Purvapaksha, by setting up the opponent who he's trying to refute, and by giving us an anatomy of the opponent's position and what its implications are. So here, the anatomy has been, look, opponent, if you think that an external object can be a percept, then you've only got 2 or 3 choices. If we follow the Tibetan tradition, you have 2 choices, wholes and a bunch of parts. And then we could think about the bunch of parts in 2 different ways, maybe. If you think of the Chinese tradition, 3 different possibilities, wholes, parts, or the supervenient entity on the parts. And I actually think that's a better way to read the text, quite frankly. I think Dharmapala had a kind of nicer reading of the structure than Vinitadeva has. But that's just me, and different people might go different ways on this. And what he's argued is that in each of these cases, you manage to fail to get the 2 conditions on the percept coming together. In case 1, the parts, you get causation, but you don't get appearance. In case 2, you get appearance, but you don't get causation. In case 3, this is why I think it's a really nicely different case, you do get appearance and causation, but what's appearing isn't what's causing, and what's causing isn't appearing, because it's only a kind of fictional entity that you've created that appears, and that fictional entity isn't doing anything causal over and above the things upon which it supervenes. So he says, we've dispensed with the external object part of the picture, but that doesn't yet establish the positive position. And in the last few verses, verses 6, 7, and 8, that we begin to establish the positive position. And we'll begin with verse 6. He says, an internal cognitive object, that is a state of mind, which appears as though external, is the object. Let's start there. That's the conclusion. And we're going to get the reason for it in a moment. So the conclusion is that if we're looking for the percept, the mikpa, the alambana isn't going to be external, but it's going to be internal to the mind. That is, it's going to be something that is going to be a state of mind that appears to be external. So again, now we're in a kind of Yogacara world where what we're going to have is a thought that we experience, an object as experienced, that we experience through subject-object duality, and in particular, as far as Dignaga is concerned, appear as existing outside of the sensory consciousness in space and just registered by the sensory consciousness. So when he talks about it appearing as external, he's talking about it as appearing through subject-object duality, even though as an internal object, it is only an aspect of the subject. Why? Because it is cognition itself and because it is its condition. And so the idea here is that when we think about this, when I ask, what causes me to have the thought, there's an elephant or there's a cup, what immediately causes me to have it is my internal representation, my internal perceptual experience of the cup. And when I ask, and then when I ask, and what appears? Well, what appears is that representation. So that we get both kind of explanatory streams, the stream of appearance and the stream of causation, as it were, uniting in a single thing, only if we think of that single thing as internal. Because then we can think of that sensory representation appearing to our mental consciousness, leading to the judgment, there's a cup, and it appears through subject-object duality to be external, but it is both the cause and the appearance of the thought, there's a cup out there. So Dignaga says, if you're looking for the place where both conditions are satisfied, the causation condition and the appearance condition, that will never happen externally. That only happens internally through the inner representation. And that inner representation might appear to be an external object, but that involves the projection of duality, not something about the representation itself. So now what we see, this is why I wanted to move from Sandhi Nirmochana to Trisvabhava Nirdesha, to Alambana Pariksha, not just because they succeed one another historically, but we can see conceptually how somebody like Dignaga, who is an idealist, was willing to take all of these ideas of the three natures and the absence of subject-object duality and what we imagine as being subject-object duality, and to deploy them through an analysis of perception to generate a kind of idealistic position. Notice that this is not Vasubandhu now, this is Dignaga. And so I'm urging you to see that all of these are part of the great Yogacara or Chittamatra world, but don't let the impetus to doxographic squeeze let you think that all three of these texts are doing the same thing or defending the same theses. We're seeing a family of theses that kind of travel together, but they're not necessarily, all the same. Now we get to that question about simultaneity and sequence that was asked so perceptively at the beginning of the last class. And I remind you, because it's easy to forget these things, especially if you're not the kind of person who is thinking about the particular terminology. One of the things that's interesting to me about this text is that of all of the terms that you could use for an object, right? In Sanskrit, we could have artha or vishya or alambana. In Tibetan, we translate those as dun, yul, and mikpa, that are very often treated as synonymous. As Geshe-Topke notes in his commentary, although they are often treated as synonymous, in particular cases, it's very important to distinguish them from one another because sometimes they come apart. The example that he gives, which is a very nice example, he says that if you're directly apprehending the emptiness of phenomena, then it might well be that the object that you're observing, the alambana, is all phenomena, but the object of thought, the din, the artha, is their emptiness. And so those are very different, they're very different things. So that in many cases, you can use these synonymously. Sometimes you need to distinguish them. And Dignaga chose here very carefully to use alambana. And one of the reasons comes up now. And that is because he's thinking about the 4 kinds of conditions. Because notice what he's thinking about are the conditions of the arising of perceptual experience. What we're asking is, what is the dependent origination story that we want to talk about that explains our the existence of perceptions of cups and perceptions of elephants, where there really are cups and elephants, right? And what he wants to say is, no talk of external objects is ever going to get you those conditions. But he's thinking of perceptual conditions. When we think about perceptual conditions, we're thinking of the 4 kinds of pratyaya, or the 4 kinds of kyen. And one of those kinds of pratyaya, one of those kinds of kyen, is the alambana pratyaya, or the mikpa kyen. And in that system of 4 kinds of conditions, that condition, the alambana pratyaya, or the mikpa kyen, is simultaneous with the thing that, to which it gives rise. That's really important. Just as my desk is the condition of my cup not being on the floor, and my computer not being on the floor, and the tables in the dining room are the condition of the computers and the microphones and the notebooks not falling to the floor. And it's important that if they satisfy those conditions, they are simultaneous. Dignaga wants to make sure that we can talk about simultaneous conditions as well as sequential conditions. And that's why he's using this term alambana, to remind us of that connection between these 2 aspects of doctrine. That's really interesting. That also reminds us of the deep connection between Madhyamaka and Yogacara, because we find these 4 conditions articulated most famously in the Madhyamaka tradition, where? In the opening verses of Nagarjuna's Mula Madhyamaka Karika. So I invite you to go back to chapter 1 of Mula Madhyamaka Karika, where you see these conditions asserted and developed. That's just a long footnote to what we're about to say. He says, even though they are simultaneous, that is, even though the percept and the perception are simultaneous, it is its condition because it is invariably concomitant. That is, the property that makes it a condition is that it satisfies the formula of dependent origination. Whenever this occurs, that occurs. Whenever that occurs, this occurs. So when the perception occurs, the percept occurs. When the percept occurs, the perception occurs. And so it is a supporting condition. It is an alambana. He says, don't get on me and say, but they're sequential, because in fact, I agree that they're simultaneous, but simultaneity is no bar to being an alambana pratyaya, to being a percept condition. So that's a very important thing to remember. And it reminds us of a very important aspect of the structure of dependent origination. Many people who are otherwise smart and thoughtful, when they hear about dependent origination, think, oh, that means that everything that happens depends upon a previous cause. It might be true that everything that happens depends on a previous cause, but also everything that occurs depends upon simultaneous causes as well. And I remind you that when we talk about parts and wholes, and that dimension of dependent origination, we're always talking about simultaneous causes, as we are when we talk about Mikpa Kyen. So that's a really important thing to remember when we talk about Buddha Dharma. And it reminds us that interdependence is a multi-dimensional thing, not a single dimension. It's not just flowing through time, but it's there in space and interdependence as well. It's sequential, but he says there's also a sequence here because of a transfer of capacity. And what that means is that when we're thinking about what gives rise to the percept and the perception together, we can think of that as the ripening of a potential in the Alaya Vijnana. And this is very important for Dignaga, and this is present there in the auto commentary, and it's something that every commentary on the text makes clear. Dharmapala's commentary makes it clear. Vinita Deva's commentary makes it clear. Gunkong doesn't talk about this, but Dendar Larampa talks about this in great detail, as does Geshe Yeshe Topke. Question?
Say it again.
I am about to say it again. You got me. That is that there is also, that this is also spelling out the relationship between perception and the ripening of potentials in the Alaya Vijnana, as well as the planting of further seeds in the Alaya Vijnana. So the idea here is that the sequence, the transfer of capacity, is that we have a capacity to perceive something, the potential to perceive a cup in our Alaya Vijnana, in our storehouse consciousness, in our unconscious mind. That capacity gives rise sequentially to an actual perception. That perception might give rise to our performing an action, which might give rise to other perceptions and so forth. So there is a set of sequential dependent origination here. And that's important because we don't want to say that the simultaneous alambana, the simultaneous percept, is the only condition of perception. That would mean that everything is simply static. We want to say that there's a simultaneous dimension of explanation of perception as well as a sequential one. Now then, and the sequential one has to go from potential to perception, to the consequence of perception, to potential for a new perception, to the consequences of that perception, and so on. And that, Dignaga says, has all to do with the ripening of potentials in the Alaya Vijnana. That, and one way of putting that is every experience that we have depends upon all kinds of unconscious cognitive experiences that we're also having. Now, you can imagine, I've just been asked to repeat that slowly. Should I repeat what I just said again? Okay, I will. Set the metronome back.
Slower.
It's very, molto largo, not just largo, molto largo. Okay. Like this. Dignaga is, in the end, after an explanation of how we actually have perceptual experience. And his explanation is going to be, pretty frankly, idealistic. And he's first begun in those first 5 verses by explaining to us why no part of the explanation can really involve external objects. And the reason is because we never see external objects. They're never our percepts. And the reason for that is that no understanding of external objects can ever bring together the two functions that a percept has. That is, we can't have causation and appearance being brought about by the same external object, and so we can never perceive them. Now, he's then said in verse 6 that an internal cognitive object can do that, because an internal cognitive object can be both what appears to mental consciousness and can be the cause of that mental consciousness. Then somebody says, but wait a minute, you're now saying that the percept and the perception are simultaneous. So how could one be the condition of another? And Dignaga says, no problem at all, because this is an alambana prachaya, and it satisfies the conditions for dependent origination, and we're already familiar with that kind of condition. Don't worry. Then somebody says, but wait a minute. If you think that all of the conditions are simultaneous, there wouldn't be any time. Nothing would ever happen. And Dignaga says, no. Calm down. I'm not saying that the alambana prachaya and its simultaneous conditions are the only condition of perception. And there are also sequential conditions. And the sequential condition involves the ripening of a potential for that perception in Alaya Vijnana, in foundation consciousness, which leads to the perception, which leads to other potentials in Alaya Vijnana, which leads to more perception, and so forth. And that transfer of capacity, of causal oomph from unconscious process to perception, to more unconscious process, to more perception, just keeps going on sequentially. So we've got both sequential and simultaneous causes. And what that reminds us is that dependent origination, whether we're talking about perception or anything else, always involves the cooperation of both sequential and simultaneous kinds of conditions. And I remind you, that does not distinguish Yogacara from Madhyamaka. That's a thesis that we find in Nagarjuna as well. And Dignaga is simply borrowing a very common pan-Buddhist understanding of the four kinds of conditions. But here he's emphasizing the alambana condition. That's the slow repetition at molto largo. Are we cool now? Making sense? It's not a bad text. It's a very good text. Dignaga was no fool. He was a really smart guy. As Vinita Deva says in his colophon, he gnaws on the heads of heretics like lions gnaw on elephant skulls. Isn't that a horrible image? But that's how Vinita Deva salutes Dignaga in his colophon. So I always have that image of Dignaga gnawing on bones. Yeah. But it's kind of scary. You get the idea these guys really loved debate. And of course, Dignaga was a very famous debater, as was Vasubandhu. It's worth remembering, by the way, as a footnote, a lot of these great masters earned their livings and the endowments for their monasteries as professional debaters for fees. And that was a big sport in classical India. Local kings or noble people would sponsor debaters and put money on them in contests. And then they would win money for their monasteries and their hospitals. And Vasubandhu was very, very famous for that. Said that he endowed many hospitals and hospices and monasteries with his debate winnings. And what that reminds us of, the reason I like to think about that is not only because I find it wonderful that whereas we bet on football and basketball in the US, these guys bet on Dharma debates. It's so weird, right? But it is history. That's our history. But it also reminds us of why some of these texts are written in the styles that they are, and of why that kind of wonderful frisson remains in Tibetan debate. It's a joyful frisson that comes from the same joy that you could have in athletic competition in a certain way. And these texts tend to be written with a certain kind of intellectual muscularity and competition in them that comes from the fact that these were highly competitive guys. So worth remembering that. It's kind of fun to add a little bit of vision and color to your memory of these people. That was a footnote. That was an aside. That was just Jay smiling about this text, and the great colophon from Vinita Deva. And Vinita Deva, remember, was an abbot of Nalanda. So he's a university president, basically, in our terms. And if you're a university president, who do you appreciate more than anybody else? Quick. It's not your faculty. It's not your students. Who is it? Donors, alumni donors, right? That's who you care about. So when Vinita Deva is writing that colophon, he's thinking, yeah, guys, get out there, debate, win your debates, more money for Nalanda. We got to copy books. It's really expensive. So that's part of what's going on there. And I just like to think about that institutional context. It makes everybody a little more human to me. So anyway, that's what I meant by talking about the simultaneity and the sequence. But then you can imagine somebody saying to Dignaga, but hold on, you're talking about sequence and you're talking about this transfer of capacity. So presumably you're talking about the power of the sense faculty to produce and to be causally responsible for these percepts. And aren't sense faculties also physical objects, external objects, things like eyes and nerves and things like that? And you can imagine an opponent saying that. You can even imagine a contemporary opponent saying that. And there we have it. A sense faculty is a cooperating sense faculty, right? That's one of the cooperating conditions that's giving rise to this. So why not agree that there have to be external objects if there have to be sense organs and things like that doing it? And Dignaga says it's not contradictory for this capacity to be also in cognition. So he's saying you think of your eyes and your sense faculties as physical objects. Ha, ha, ha. When's the last time you saw one? Oh, you've seen your eye? Let's talk about the perception of that eye. Near as I can tell, the external eye can't be the percept of that eye, not an eye as a physical object, because you would have to be either seeing the subatomic particles or you'd have to be seeing the whole eye. If it was the particles, it wouldn't appear. If it was the eye, it wouldn't cause. If it was something that supervenes on those particles, then we've already shown that you've illicitly put the causation and the representation together. So all you've really seen is a percept of an eye, and a percept of an eye we've already said is in cognition. So ha, ha, ha. You're never going to get out of cognition to get a physical object, even as a cooperating cause. All you can talk about are percepts ripening in Alaya Vijnana, and that capacity that's in Alaya Vijnana, and the object, percept that we experience cause one another, both as internal mental objects, and they have done so from beginningless time.
Say that last part again.
I will. So, since even you, objector, who think that sense faculties or sense organs may be causally responsible for our perception, just like external objects, and you might think, aha, Dignaga, I've caught you. You've had to posit something external, namely the sense faculty or the sense organ, as a cause of the percept. So you see, something has to be external, you might say. And by the way, this isn't a foolish objection to think about, largely because Dignaga is thinking about Asanga here. And if we read Bodhisattva Bhumi and we see Asanga's discussion of perception at the beginnings of that, he talks a lot about the relationship between the physical body and the mind in perception. That's a stream of Yogacara thought that is not idealistic. Dignaga wants to say, no, no, no. Follow Vasubandhu in things like the 20 verses, not Asanga in the Bodhisattva Bhumi here. So he's saying, so you think that physical objects such as eyes are relevant. He says, let me ask you about that physical object that you posit, that eye that you say that you see. I mean, obviously you don't see your own eye because you can't, but you see somebody else's eye. Or you could, if you want, don't do this, but you could take your eye, one eye out and see it with the other eye. But this is very dangerous. And the ophthalmologists do not recommend this as an approach to doing philosophy. So you see somebody else's eye and you say, oh, she's seeing by means of that eye that I see. Dignaga then asks you a very hard question. He says, so you think you see that eye? You're having a perceptual experience now, are you? Very cool. And it has a percept, right? Is that percept external or internal, that eye that you see? Well, if it's external, then you're...
Slow down.
Yep. It's either external or internal, right? If it's external, then it's either the fundamental dharmas that make it up, or it's the whole eye, or it's the dharmas all taken together somehow as a whole. Well, if it's the fundamental particles, then they might be causing your perception, but they're not appearing. So the eye isn't appearing to you. Or if it's an eye that's appearing, then since it's an assembly of subatomic particles, it can't be what's doing the causing. And if you say, no, 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 I mean an eye that supervenes on those particles, then he says, sorry, The causation is all in the particles. The thing that supervenes is just this fiction upon them that has no causal power. So you haven't been able to identify an external percept that corresponds to it. So just relax and assume that that sense faculty in the eye that you're thinking of as physical are also only in consciousness. And so we've packed the whole perceptual process back into consciousness, with percepts causing capacities, causing percepts, causing capacities, and it went from beginningless time. Isn't that sweet? So this is how you get a nice idealistic picture.
What are the capacities again?
By the capacities, we mean the kind of causal conditions that give rise to these percepts. So that can be the potential, the ripening of a potential in Alaya Vijnana. But what he's saying is, if you think that that capacity, and that can also be among those capacities, are the sense organ, the sense faculty, and the sense consciousness. Those would give us the capacity to see, or similarly with the other senses, the olfactory organ, the olfactory consciousness, the olfactory cognition. And he's saying, don't think that by positing those, you've succeeded in positing something external and physical. Because again, to posit them, they would have to be somehow perceptible to you. And if they're perceptible, there's a percept. And if there's a percept, then go back to verse 1 and show yourself why it can't be external, that it's merely internal. So even all of those other conditions of perception, like the alambana, like the mikpa, like the percept object, have to be thought of as internal, if they're percepts you ever thought about. That's the alambana pariksha. I like this text a lot. I think it's a very, very clever little text. And it shows us the more idealistic face of Yogacara.
What does Asanga say about this? Does he say the sense faculties are external or internal?
Well, of course, Asanga doesn't say anything about this text because Asanga is dead before this text is written. But if we're about this topic, it's very noteworthy. And I think this is important when people look at the history of Yogacara. When we read the Yogacara Bhumi, the Yogacara stages that Asanga wrote, when we look at all the first chapters of that text, they're all about the body. Some of them are even about medicine, and they're about the interaction between the body and the mind. And so Asanga is not driving this idealistic version of Yogacara at all. In that sense, his understanding is much more consistent with that we see in the Samdhina Mochana Sutra than it is with this particular text. On the other hand, as I've mentioned a few times, Asanga's little brother, Vasubandhu, did write texts that were explicitly idealistic. And the classic one of those is the 20 verses, the Vimshataka, which really does go out of its way to argue that the very idea of an external object is incoherent. And you know, we are pretty familiar with those arguments. It has to do with whether partless particles can come together to constitute wholes, and neither one nor many arguments, and arguments about how dreams are just like perception and so forth. So there's certainly both idealistic and non-idealistic strains in the great Yogacara universe of texts. And what I've been trying to point out is, maybe successfully, maybe unsuccessfully, is that if we pay attention to the very kind of early stratum of Yogacara texts, that is sutra work. So when I try to think about a Buddhist school, I usually do it this way. I usually say, start with the founding sutra literature. That's kind of, for me, the doctrinal ground. Then look at the way that Indian philosophers composing shastras, composing, independent philosophical texts, referred to and used those sutras and then look at the commentaries on those Shastras to see the evolution of the thought in that school. And this is a way of thinking about textuality that is kind of very much reflects the fact that I'm trained primarily as a philosopher and then part of a historian of philosophy. So when I think of a philosophical idea, I think of it in terms of its history. And when I think about a text, I try to think of it both in terms of the texts to which it's responding and the text that it's anticipating as commentaries. So when I look at the Samdhinirmochana, I say, gee, if Yogacara is supposed to be idealistic, is there idealism here? No, I don't see it. I see a phenomenology. On the other hand, if I look at the Lankavatara, I do think there are idealistic strains in the Lankavatara. And then interestingly, when I look at the Shastra literature, I look at the very earliest Shastra literature that's associated with Yogacara, say Asanga, I also don't see much idealism there. I see a very phenomenological approach. But very quickly it pops up with his little brother, who does give it an idealistic twist, but also writes non-idealistic texts. So I see Vasubandhu is kind of on the fence. He's saying, yeah, I can give it an idealistic read or a non-idealistic read. And then when I get to Dignaga in the Pramanavada tradition, and remember, this is one strain within the Yogacara world, the Pramanavada tradition, then I see the idealism taking over as Dignaga starts thinking about pramanas. And oftentimes, when we are approaching a tradition, we kind of approach it backwards. That is, we start looking at the very latest commentarial texts and take those as representing somehow the whole tradition. And so it's easy to project the views of those texts on everything. And I'm just saying, resist that. Resist the idea to see a doctrinal system that's as large and vast as Yogacara as being uniform. See it rather as a kind of having texts that are related to each other and have a family resemblance, and appreciate the diversity of views that, that lie within that tradition and the ways in which they can be developed. I think that makes it more interesting. And it also means that if you see stuff that you think really needs to be refuted, say if you're a good prasangika madhyamaka and you think idealism has to have a stake driven through its heart wherever it appears, that's fine. You can do that, but you don't then have to abandon the rest of the tradition and what you can learn from it, because there's still stuff left, right? And I think that's a really good lesson to learn. So if you ask me whether I really love the Alambana Pariksha, I do. I spent a lot of time working on it. Am I convinced by the idealism of it? No, I'm not. I don't think it's correct to say that it follows that we don't have to think about external objects. I do think there are important things that I learn, namely when I think about perception and I want to understand where this appearance and causation come together, that really is internal. That makes me think that the perceptual process is complex, not simple, doesn't lead me to an idealism. But it doesn't follow from the fact that I reject Dignaga's idealism, that I say, okay, therefore, I want to just put Yogacara aside and not pay any attention to it and not take it seriously except as a thing to refute. I want to see what else is in that tradition. And when I do, I find immense riches, riches that help me understand the nature of experience, riches that help me understand the nature of mind, riches that help me understand the depth of emptiness, riches that help me understand ethical perspectives. And those are the riches that I really want to share with you, not the idea that, guess what, there are no external objects. That I think is harder for many of us to take seriously. Does that help a little bit? Many questions I see now. Who's first? Way in the back.
So just following this thought of no external objects,
Yeah,
leaves me with a question of who and where are the sentient beings that we're trying to lead out of samsara and into full awakening?
yeah.
And where is the suffering that we're trying to alleviate?
Right. That's always a big question for the idealistic wing of Yogacara. And I can tell you how Yogacharans answer that. I'm not going to defend those answers. I do think that idealism is a very dangerous kind of doctrine, as Chandrakirti points out as well. But I can tell you how Vasubandhu responds to that. There are two kinds of responses that you can give. One of those responses, which is the one that Vasubandhu uses in 20 verses, is to say, even though I don't directly see other sentient beings, we have shared karma. And so there are different sentient beings who each have experiences. And once I understand the nature of my own experience, I understand there are other sentient beings having those experiences, and they have worlds that are full of suffering, and that I can work to alleviate those. The other answer is a little more flat-footed. It's to say, what other sentient beings? The only other sentient beings there are the ones in my mind. But since those sentient beings and their suffering in my mind are sources of my suffering, if I want to escape from suffering, I've still got to alleviate their suffering. And this is the kind of dream analogy. So you could think about it like this. Suppose you're deep in sleep and you're having a very, very vivid dream. And that very vivid dream is a dream in which there are a lot of other sentient beings with terrible things happening to them. They're dying of coronavirus. They're under the political sway of a pathological liar. They're living in a world where other countries are under the sway of pathological liars. Climate change is destroying the environment. And you have this very vivid dream about all of this stuff. If you're having that very vivid dream, then you have two options, but you are presumably suffering. This isn't a positive dream. This is the kind of dream that you wake up and you say, I had this horrible nightmare last night. You can't believe how awful it was. I still feel bad from it, right? A really bad dream. And there are two ways you could resolve the suffering that you experience in that dream, because you recognize then that your experience is permeated by suffering, and that suffering is caused in part by the suffering of other sentient beings, that is, dream sentient beings. One way you could do it is to work in that dream to alleviate their suffering. That is, you could kind of do a lucid dreaming thing, right? And you could say, okay, I'm going to dream that a Democrat wins the White House in the fall. I'm going to change my dream. I'm going to dream that a vaccine is generated. I'm going to dream, you could just work on that, right? And I'll do the things in my dream that I need to do. And then you transform the dream from a nightmare to a really pleasant dream. And that's a way of thinking about a release from suffering. Another thing you could do, as your mom probably taught you a long time ago, when you're having a really bad dream like that, what are the two words I'm going to say? Wake up. We have a word for that in Sanskrit. We call it bodhi. So you could wake up from that dream and stop dreaming and recognize that it was all in your mind. And either of those you could imagine as solutions. And you see both of those kinds of explanations in the Yogacara tradition. Now, as I say, I do think that idealism probably is not in the end the best way to think about our relationship to the world. And I think that Chandrakirti is right about that. In Madhyamaka Avatara, in the 6th chapter, he really explains very carefully why we don't want to think about idealism as that solution. Nonetheless, it's worth seeing that Yogacara philosophers saw the force of that objection, and we do find these responses to it in that form. Does that help a little bit?
Thank you.
And that's why the dream analogy plays such a gigantic role in Yogacara thought. By the way, if you're interested in dreams and what you can and can't do in dreams, one of the greatest philosophical movies of all time that is also useful for thinking about Yogacara is a movie called Waking Life. It's an interestingly animated film, And it's taking the dream hypothesis, the idea that all of reality is happening in a dream, very seriously. And it's not written by Buddhists, it's written by contemporary philosophers of mind. But it's a lot of fun, and you can use it to teach Yogacara very, very well. So if in lockdown you're saying, what movie should I watch? Should it be an action movie starring Steven Seagal Rinpoche? Or should it be a movie from which I'll learn something? Then I would say Waking Life is a really good film that you can both enjoy and learn something about Yogacara at the same time. So I leave you with that particular thought. Now, we've succeeded in doing what I'd hoped to do, but didn't believe I could do, and that is to leave a half hour for general discussion of everything that we've talked about and any other topic people want to raise. At the end of all of this, I'm kind of astonished that I did that, because usually I attempt to do that and fail. So the floor is open for any kinds of questions, issues, topics of discussion that we've managed to raise in the last 17 sessions. Where do you want to go with this? I do have a couple of things in the queue. Oh, go for it, Chidrina.
This isn't a question, it's a comment.
Good.
I think it would have been very helpful, at least to me, if you had given this overview of the different Yogacarya strands and their history at the very beginning.
Okay.
Yeah, just for next time.
Okay.
Lay out the big picture of everything that's going on with Yogacara and who says what, and you know, how it's interpreted by the traditions as it goes on. That would be very helpful.
Okay. I'm sorry that I didn't do it that way. Yeah. We could start again. Rewind. Yeah, thank you very much for that. Yeah. You never quite know when you choose one of these what the best pedagogical strategy would be. And actually, my hope was to try to keep idealism off the table until the very end, to try to not push people in that direction. And so I was being a little cagey, but maybe that was the wrong thing to do.
If you had said at the beginning, there, and you're trying not to push people in that direction, then we wouldn't have, or at least I wouldn't have been biting at the whatever you bite at, saying when is
chomping at the bit.
when is the idealism coming into the picture, because I know it's there somewhere.
Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful. I'm sorry. I apologize. More evidence of my vast imperfection as a teacher. If there are no other questions from the Abbey, I'll go to the Q&A panel because there's a few there. And I'll talk about those while people in the Abbey begin to dream up the other things they want to say or to ask. Because I really want this to be a time when we can step back from the minutiae of the text that we've been looking at, look at the big picture, and think about this. Jim Hare asks the question, is the Buddha mind the purified Alaya? And we do see that discussion in that definition in Yogacara texts. And the important term there, the Sanskrit term, is ashraya pravarti, complete transformation of the basis. That the transformation from an impure foundation consciousness to a completely pure foundation consciousness with no potentials, with no kleshas, no potentials for dualistic experience is what we have in awakening. And we do see that in Yogacara texts. And questions about how that's possible are the questions that really animate Yogacara theorists about path. Remember, a lot of Buddha's path literature in every tradition is animated by that question. How do you get from impurity to purity if all you've got are impure tools? And we've talked about that as we've gone on. Tupten Kundrul asks a question. Are the objects of experience in this world the foundations of becoming a Buddha? Oh, what a glorious question. My own view, and I won't try to, make anybody else in the tradition take any blame for it, is that it has to be. That what could there be as a foundation for the apprehension of emptiness other than empty phenomena? What could there be as an object, an alambana for the Brahma Viharas other than actual sentient beings? Without conventional reality, without a world that we experience, how could there be an ultimate reality? Without a Buddha field, how could there be a Buddha? And I just think very seriously the idea that Buddhism, the Buddhist philosophy, forces us to either deny the reality of the world that we live in, or forces us to ignore the world that we live in favor of some other world, is undermined by everything that we really can understand in Buddhist philosophy. And again, I'll come back to the Vimalakirti Nirdesha Sutra. The Vimalakirti Nirdesha Sutra, in emphasizing the non-duality of the purified world of nirvana and the impure world of samsara, is really emphasizing that all nirvana is the impure world seen the right way. Nagarjuna makes the same point when he says there's not the slightest difference between samsara and nirvana, not the subtlest thing separates them. I can't imagine what the foundation could be of the path for awakening other than where we are now. Another way of putting that, the last metaphor I'll use, Buddhism is all about a path. I can't figure out how you could get to the end of the path without the path. So that's my own view. I won't blame anybody else for it. Snehi asks as an overview, please explain why Yogacara thought arose in response to Nagarjuna's teachings. What did they see as lacking in Madhyamaka thought? That's a really good question. Historically, of course, it's a very difficult question to answer because those guys aren't around anymore and they never specifically said, here's the issue. On the other hand, we do see a bit of that issue in Samdhinirmochana Sutra in chapter 7, when the Buddha says to Paramartha Samagata, I was kind of bothered by the fact that people were getting nihilistic by thinking that all we're talking about is the lack of intrinsic nature in things. And we see two answers to that question that both riff on that. One answer is that a lot of Madhyamaka literature, you might think, invites a nihilistic interpretation. And when I say invites, I don't mean that that's the right interpretation, but that I mean that a lot of people, both within the Buddhist tradition and especially outside of the Buddhist tradition, who have read Madhyamaka, have seen it as the doctrine of complete non-existence. And I mean, if you don't believe me, look at any history of Indian philosophy written by a non-Buddhist Indian thinker who will tell you that Madhyamaka Buddhism was the doctrine of complete nihilism that says that the world doesn't exist at all. And so you can imagine Yogacara as saying, wait a minute, there's a way to give this a positive spin. And the three natures help to give it a positive spin. But a second reason, I think is a little deeper than that, though I'm not denigrating that reason. I do think it's important to see that this worry about nihilism that's raised by Madhyamaka texts must have been on the minds of some Yogacara thinkers. But the other thing I think that's more powerfully on their mind, and this is the idea that, as I say, I only learned from His Holiness, and I realized much later that he's learned it from Bhutan, who's learned it from Rangton, is that Madhyamaka, as an account of emptiness, is in a certain sense pedagogically incomplete, even not philosophically incomplete. Pedagogically incomplete because it only operates from the side of the object in its analysis. And it doesn't give us a real understanding of exactly how the mind contributes to this and exactly how the structure of our consciousness gives rise to the appearance of an intrinsically existent world if there isn't one there in the first place. And so you can imagine Yogacaran thinkers saying, let's look at it that way as well. It's one thing to have a map to Chicago from the west, and there's nothing wrong with that. Let's also show how to get there from the east. So I think it's kind of completing a picture, and I think that's a nice way of seeing it. The first turning of the wheel, as His Holiness says, gives us a wonderful comprehensive picture of the relationship between samsara and nirvana and why it's important to get from samsara to nirvana. The second turning of the wheel explains emptiness from the side of the object. The third explains it from the side of the subject. And that gives, altogether, you get completeness. And so I think that that's more what's driving the evolution of Yogacaran thought, just trying to complete the whole philosophical picture that's about 2/3 complete by the time we get to the end of the Madhyamaka tradition. And that's not to say that it's correcting an error. It's kind of completing and elaborating a philosophical picture in the way that commentaries complete and elaborate the philosophical picture developed in root texts. So just if you were to say, given that Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti were nearly omniscient and gave us a perfect presentation of Madhyamaka, why did Jade Tsongkhapa feel he had to write Sashitichen commentary or Umagompa Rabsel? Because they were already so brilliant and they were such beautiful texts. How could they possibly need commentary? And if they're definitive and don't require interpretation, why bother interpreting them? Well, because A, some people misinterpret them, so it's nice to set people right. And B, a lot of things that they say can be explained more deeply and more extensively if you take the time to really spell them out. So the same thing that we could say about the relationship between commentary and root, we can say about the relationship between subsequent traditions and earlier traditions. It doesn't require competition, it just requires supplementation. That's my view. Yes, question right by the window.
Thank you. I have two questions. The first is, my understanding is that in India, the Chittamatra was broken into two schools in terms of tenets.
Yep.
And so one of them accepted external objects and one didn't.
Oh, I'd be careful about that way of drawing the distinction. I think there are two distinctions that are important, and I don't want to see them as the same distinction. So one distinction is between Yogacharans who do accept the existence of external objects and ones who don't, say Asanga versus Vasubandhu, if you want to do it crudely. But, and Geshe Yeshutapkyala, as does Dendar Laharampa, both make that point in their commentaries to Alambana Pariksha. So if you read Dendar's commentary and you read Geshe Yeshutapkya's commentary, you'll see that distinction. That's not so much a distinction between different schools of Yogacara, but I would say different strains within the tradition. But usually when people talk about the two big schools of Yogacara, they mean Yogacharans who, trying to get these words is all really weird, but the way that I like to do it is who think that representations themselves are real versus Yogacharans who think that representations themselves are also unreal. So sometimes called the true representation versus the false representation, or if you prefer aspect rather than representation as a translation of Nampa or Akara, true aspect versus false aspect. I think aspect works really badly here, by the way, but representation works well. That distinction is not by itself a distinction with regard to external objects. It's a different distinction, and you don't want to run them together, they cross-cut. So you could have 4 boxes here. And the way that distinction works is this. Once you decide that our experience is representation only, right? Once you decide that when we think about the objects as we know them, we only know them as they appear to us. So you take those representations now as your object of analysis, rather than thinking you're taking external objects or dualistic appearances or anything like that. You could then ask a really interesting question. The question you could ask is, okay, do those representations exist as I experience them? That is my experience of them true to their nature? Or can I be deluded about the representations themselves in the same way that I seem to be deluded about external objects? So as we looked in trees from Havanirdesh, we saw the latter position, right? That even when I pay attention to the nature of my own mind, the fact that my representations appear through dualistic appearance means that they are deceptive, even with regard to their mode of existence as representations. And so you get the false representation view. But if you thought instead, well, no, since the representations are part of mind, and mind is all that exists, then even if my mode of understanding the representations is diluted, the representations themselves are present as they are, then you get the true representation view. Now notice that neither of those is a thesis about the relationship between representations and external objects. That's a distinction among ways to understand the relationship between the mind and its own representations. So you could take either of those views and then say, oh yeah, but I think there really are external objects, or say, oh, and by the way, I don't. So there's really a four-way split there. Does that help?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's really tricky. And different people really go different ways on which of these is a kind of preferable way to understand Yogacara. Myself, I'm really taken by this intuition behind the false representation view, behind the idea that even when I think about my own representation of a pot, or my own representation of a tree, or my own representation of a sentient being, and I say, okay, I'm not going to get fooled and think that there's an external object with which I'm immediately engaged, or I'm not going to think that that subject-object duality is right. But I think that I'd also better not be fooled to think, by the way, there's me and my representation, and that I apprehend that representation just as it is. Because I think the same analysis that convinces me that I can be deluded about externality and subject-object duality means that I can be deluded about my own experience. I find that to be very profound.
And then my second question is, so if I understand this, Vasubandhu took more of the idealistic approach, at least in some of his writings.
Some texts, yeah.
Masanga did not.
Mm-hmm.
So then I'm wondering how the commentarial tradition, does it split out that way, and where Stiramati falls?
Okay.
And like, what would you, if you wanted to read something from the commentarial tradition over from India or China or Tibet, whatever, yeah, what would you read to understand that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And here's how I would put it. I think that because of the enormous tendency in both Indian and Tibetan literature to doxographic unification, to trying to see all of the texts in any doxographic category, in any doctrine, in any tenet system, as it's often translated, as fundamentally agreeing with one another and expounding the same position, that we tend to get interpretations of texts that force them into agreement a lot. And as I said at the beginning, I think that's one thing I'm trying to convince you not to do, to read the doxographies and gain what you gain from them, but then put them aside and go back to the root texts themselves, or the Shastras, and really take a look and see what they say. So the idealistic interpretation of Yogacara has become so prominent, I think partly because of Chandrakirti's critique of Yogacara, and Stiramati's idealism, because Stiramati was an idealist, and he really was a big systematizer, that the phenomenological side of Yogacara and the realistic side of Yogacara has tended to get lost, which is why I've been emphasizing it so much. Not because it's the only strain, but because, this is kind of a recovery operation, trying to get at the stuff that I think was left by the side of the road and should be picked up, dusted off, and we should pay attention to it. So I would say if you really read commentaries just on Yogacara Bhumi, on Asanga's stages of the path, then you tend to get less focus on the idealism. And it's I think, a lot of fun. Yeah.
Is there an English translation of the Yogacara Bhumi?
Yeah. I think it was Brunholzel who did it. Published by Wisdom Publications.
Carl Brunholz.
Yeah, Carl Brunholzel, yeah. He's been translating these big texts for us in beautiful translations at an unbelievable rate, and I really love his work.
Yeah.
I've got a few questions in the Q&A panel that maybe I'll hit very quickly. I'm picking and choosing a little bit. Jim Hare asks, could we just as well say that conventional reality is an object of observation for purification? Vimalakirti's definition of nirvana. I'd be really careful about that, because you really have to, what we're talking about here is not the artha, not the dön, but the mikpa, what that kind of percept is, how we're seeing it. And remember the idea of the dependent nature. The distinction between the dependent nature, which really is just dependent origination. It's not an object of purification unless it's observed empty of the imagined. So dependent origination or conventional reality is only an object of purification to the extent that it's apprehended as empty. And that's harder than it sounds. That involves a purified vision. So if you think about the Vimalakirti Nirdesha Sutra, the instructions aren't, oh, just look at conventional reality, you're fine. The instructions are, you've got to perceive it as pure. You've got to perceive that Buddha field as empty, and that's the real trick. And notice that, you know, the text itself keeps pointing out all of the ways in which you can fail to do that. Connor McCann asks, how does Dignaga work with the problem of reflexivity? Dignaga does defend the reality of reflexive awareness, and Dignaga is one of the people who really is important in advancing that position. He argues that we need to understand reflexive awareness in order to understand why conscious states are conscious, and especially in order to understand the possibility of memory. Chandrakirti, of course, attacks Dignaga's arguments regarding reflexive awareness, and Jade Tsongkhapa, not surprisingly, sides with Chandrakirti in rejecting reflexive awareness. I think that that's one of the ways in which Jade Tsongkhapa is so right, that doctrine of reflexive awareness, which is very common now, and a lot of people in contemporary phenomenology adopted. It's not just a Buddhist doctrine. I think it's just crazy. And I think that Tsongkhapa is right to reject it. But it's something that Dignaga very much does defend. Dharmakirti defends it, and it's very common in the Yogacara tradition, really starting with Dignaga. Ron Kessiker asks me to comment on a statement from my biography. And I'm going to see what he says that I said. He says, how can a culture that has, this is their base, oh, I know what he's worried about. He's worried about this empirical work that I did with Sean Nichols and Nina Strominger and Arun Rai on fear of death. In which we found this really surprising to some people, but not surprising to me actually, result that the stronger people's belief, and this is a big study and you should read the study, it's complicated, but here's the surprise payoff. The more that people tend to believe in no self, the more terrified they tend to be of death, which is not what you're told is going to happen, right? And in particular, Tibetan monastics were a lot, in this group, were a lot more scared of death than lay Tibetans, who were a lot more scared of death than Christians and Hindus. So you had this kind of really strong. And if you looked at very detailed stuff, it really was a correlation, right? The more you believe in no self, the scarier death is. And the question is why? We do have a hypothesis about that. And in order to confirm that hypothesis, we need to do a further study, which we've not been able to get funding for yet. And now with coronavirus, it'll be a while before we could possibly do that. Anyway, the quick bottom line is, just as there are two sources of self-grasping, there are two kinds of thoughts you might have about death. And roughly, it's like this. If you think about the self to which you grasp intrinsically, that you grasp innately, that self isn't a self that you innately grasp as continuing across lives. You kind of innately grasp it as a self in this life, and that's why you're scared to die, right? You're not saying, oh, gee, I'm scared to die because I'm worried about my next body. You're scared to die because you say, oh my God, I'm not going to exist anymore, right? And that's kind of innate. And so if you really thought that there was ideologically, that nonetheless there is a self, that self will continue in future lives, either because you believe in an Atman that's going to be reborn, or a soul that's going to be reborn into eternal life in heaven, then that's a kind of soulless against soulless, not soulless, against that says, don't worry, I don't need to worry about that self discontinuing. But if you decide there is no such self, you lose that solace, and then the terror, oh my God, I won't exist anymore, doesn't have any kind of compensation. And so what we think is that you've really got to go far enough that you don't have that self-grasping at all in order to really get the decrease in fear of death. And we think that means if what we had looked at, if we were to look at very long-term accomplished meditators, we'd find a U-curve. That, sure, mindfulness of death and thinking about impermanence gets scarier and scarier and scarier. But then when you've got it, it falls off. But we can't confirm that yet because we haven't got the money we need to look at the long-term meditators. And when we get it, I'm hoping that that actually happens. Got one question left in the Q&A. It says, in monastic universities, with the Yogacara theories and the three natures taught because an understanding of them leads to a deeper understanding and appreciation of the Madhyamaka view. As by using the three natures, we can understand, analyze the lack of intrinsic nature. See, if we went up to that question, I'd say yes. But when we add that last clause, I'd say no. Because curricularly, we usually teach Yogacara. So we teach Vaibhashika, then we teach Sautrantika, then we teach Yogacara, then we teach Madhyamaka. Because the way the curriculum is structured is, you teach the most basic, easiest to understand view. Then you teach the next view that has the resources to refute it. Then you teach the next view that has the resources to refute that. And so you understand each view better by seeing why it's superior to and can refute the view before it. And that's really pedagogically valuable. But that means that Yogacara often gets taught as, yeah, it's better than Sautrantika, but hold on, you're going to refute that view in a few years when you get to Madhyamaka. So you get a deeper understanding of Madhyamaka when you see how much better it is than Yogacara. Not because you see, oh, yes, it incorporates the three natures and three naturelessnesses. They tend to get tossed aside, throwing out the, I think, throwing out the baby with the bathwater. But that's just me. And I think we've now hit the point where we need to dedicate some merit. But before we do that, I want to once again thank everybody for, wasn't Karl Brunhauser with that one? No, it was Artemis Engel translated that one. I just realized it. It came back into my mind. Artemis Engel did that translation. Brunhauser also done some important ones.
He only translated the Bodhisattva Bhumi, not the whole.
Right, but that's the only section we need for this. Yeah, for this point, for the stuff on the body. Yeah, it's Art Engel, it's not Brunhauser. But Brunhauser, I don't want to disparage Karl. He's also translated vast texts recently, and they're really good. I just got confused. I had this nagging in the back of my head. I think I'm wrong about that, and it just hit me. When you get old, you do that. You start confusing translators. Once you start confusing translators, it's time to start worrying about your death and set your affairs in order. But now I really do, again, want to really deeply, from the bottom of my heart, thank the Abbey for making this possible. It's some of my some of my favorite time that I've spent. It's allowed me to rethink these ideas that I really like to think about. I really have loved the questions and the discussion and the time I've spent with you, and to thank all of the people who have participated on the Zoom and on the YouTube videos. Your questions have been really useful to me too, and I feel like I'm getting to know some of you as well. It's been a source of pure joy, and I can't thank you enough. Now we should dedicate merit.
Can't pull it- No, you can't pull it further, otherwise it'll.
Do you want to? Okay, Jay, we also want to thank you. Yeah,
I
for
didn't do anything.
you know, we had no idea that you were doing all these meetings in the break time and spending your life on Zoom. And yet you still came back to every session filled with energy, speaking 100 miles a minute, and you know, and presenting all these new ideas and dealing with all the questions. And we really appreciate your dedication to this topic and to explaining it to us.
Well, thank you. As you know, that wasn't the plan. I mean, the plan was I was going to be out there and not thinking about anything administrative.
Yeah.
But stuff happened.
And we also want to thank the Zoom team here at the Abbey. The nuns who have been involved in it have been working really hard. They are not professional techies, and they've become semi-professional techies, pulling out their hair, which is very good because then they don't need to cut it. But we want to really thank them for
Yes, indeed.
they've done. And I hope all the people who are tuning into the Zoom, you know, really can see the dependent arising here of you coming as a teacher, and then these people working very hard behind the scenes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you.
A couple of things I want to say. One is to also appreciate that the participants really hung in there. There were 60 some odd people for every session. People were really devoted and committed to that. So it has this, it's not the same as having you here, but it has the sense of being connected and sharing in this teaching together. And so, Jay, if you were here, of course, we would now be standing up. We would offer you a gift. You would offer us something, maybe, I don't know, but there would be a lot of personal exchange.
There
What I
would
want
be.
to say for the people online is that, as we said before, if you do want to continue to make offerings,
Support the Abbey.
well, just know that the directions are on the website, on that same page you've been referring to. And when you make that offering, either by check or by the website, please be very clear how you want that directed, and we'll take care of that from there. And then finally, let's see, Venerable Dancho sent up a note that says there's 60 people online, but over 100 people, including the people watching on YouTube. So it's a big community that's been involved in this, really wonderful. As we do our closing dedication, we're going to add verses that we have not been dedicating before. We call it Star Spangled Compassion. The text is on that page on the website for those. We sent it to you, Jay, I hope.
No, you didn't, but that's okay.
Okay, I think you'll appreciate it.
I will.
Start with our regular dedications.
Due to this merit, may we soon attain the awakened state of Guru Buddha, that we may be able to liberate all sentient beings from their suffering. May the precious Bodhi mind, not yet born, arise and grow. May that born have no decline, but increase forevermore. In the snowy mountain pure land, you're the source of good and happiness. Powerful Tenzing Gyatso Chenrezig, may you stay until samsara ends. May all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled, with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms, and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and other delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness and prosperity. May all who are ill or injured quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may these never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other for as long as space endures, and as long as living beings remain. Until then, may I to abide, to dispel the miseries of the world.
Wow.
Yeah, so may we use that to purify tremendously the karma that preceded it, and transform that thought to
Thank you.
what rules and reigns.
Indeed.
Thank you, Jay.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you.